is this true? Looking at all the evidence from randomized trials to see, does lowering LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, is there a clear correlation with reduction in heart attacks, strokes, etc., and death? And we found there was no clear correlation. It was bunkum.
Dr. Aseem Malhotra, welcome to the show. How you doing?
It's great to see you again, Max.
Same. We met a couple years ago in New York. You were doing press for, what was the name of the documentary you were part
Big
of?
Fat Fix, actually.
Big Fat Fix.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Frank Lippman, I think. Maybe connecting us, and we did a screening, and with Nina Teicholz, we did a screening in New York.
Yes, you've always been a very progressive thinker when it comes to, I mean, your background is cardiology with regard to diet and cardiovascular disease risk factors and the like. Why don't you, I mean, from a high level, share your background with us?
Yeah, so I qualified from Edinburgh Medical School 2001, so I've been a qualified practicing doctor for well over 20 years. My initial subspecialty training within cardiology was interventional cardiology. So for lay people, that basically means things like heart stents, keyhole heart surgery, if you like. And then over the last, say, probably now coming on for 7 years, maybe a bit longer, I have shifted more towards prevention. But obviously with that background knowledge of understanding coronary artery disease in a lot of detail. And I've been campaigning certainly for the last decade, maybe a little bit longer, on two big issues that I think are causing unnecessary suffering to the population and my patients and adding increased stress to the healthcare systems around the world. And those two drivers are manipulations and excesses of big food and big pharma. So I have been really active in exposing their misdemeanors, but also offering people more complete, honest information on how they can optimize their mental and physical health. But of course, for me, all of that ultimately comes down to the heart. And all of those risk factors for chronic disease are also the same risk factors for heart disease.
Yeah, I mean, and the documentary that you were part of at the beginning was really advocating to welcome fat back to the table, which for so many decades has been demonized.
Yes. So what we tried to do through the documentary, it's called, was help people understand what are the secrets of longevity. And a lot of the longevity secrets are related to people not dying of heart disease, because heart disease is still the biggest cause of premature death in European men and, one of the biggest killers in the world. So we want people to understand, where did that originate from in terms of the understanding of heart disease and why certain countries in the Mediterranean regions had less heart disease, and there was lots of different hypotheses floating about. So we went back to the original village where Ansel Keys, the American scientist, actually had huge influence on dietary guidelines, where he conducted his research in this place called Pioppi in southern Italy. And myself, and when I say we, my co-producer, and then we wrote a book together, Donal O'Neill, former international athlete, who I know you met and you know. We tried to understand, going to that village, how do these people live? And how could we marry their way of living with modern medical, up-to-date nutrition science to try and cut through what exactly was the likely contributor to their longevity. And of course, with everything that we know now, clearly it wasn't about having low cholesterol.
So many people today fear, well, from a dietary standpoint, still dietary cholesterol and saturated fat. Why is that? And have we been misled?
Yeah, I think if we come back to the cholesterol hypothesis first, and everything else, we can work around that to understand why this has been at best flawed thinking and at worst actually harmful. And I'll explain that a bit later. It comes back to so essentially, why were we even talking about this? Well, the issue really started from the 1920s onward. In America and many countries in Europe, there was a gradual increase in people dying of heart attacks and heart disease, which peaked in the sort of 60s and 70s. And scientists were trying to figure out what was driving it. And it's important to remember, actually, even as late on as 1970, there still wasn't that fully accepted understanding that we have now of the impact of smoking, right? So that was kind of missed in some respects. But certainly in the nutrition world, there was a battle going on between American physiologist Ansel Keys and a British nutrition scientist called John Yudkin. He said it was sugar. Yudkin said it was sugar was a problem, and Ansel Keys said it was saturated fat. And the reason for that is that Ansel Keys had conducted research where, and it wasn't just his research, it was actually other research as well, which showed that there was a relationship with high cholesterol and the development of heart disease. specifically what we call LDL cholesterol. But when you look at that data in detail, that correlation, Max, was only really there for people who had very high levels of cholesterol. So people who have a condition called familial hyperlipidemia, affects about 1 in 250 people. So these are people that would have total cholesterols that were above 300 milligrams per deciliter, or more than, say, 10 millimoles per liter in European standard units. And on the other side, what was interesting was that people who had very low levels of cholesterol didn't tend to develop heart disease prematurely. And then it was presumed that the relationship was linear. The higher your cholesterol, the higher your risk of heart disease, and therefore lowering it would be the solution moving forward. But what we now understand is, well, first and foremost, the genetic links don't necessarily mean that for everybody else there is a risk with total cholesterol. And then the next question to ask is, does lowering cholesterol make any difference? And of course, saturated fat in the diet does have an effect to some degree on the so-called bad cholesterol, LDL. But it also affects the HDL cholesterol. And when we do risk calculators, and that was even determined by even the late 90s, when you do risk calculators for heart disease and you plug in different things like your age, whether you're diabetic, whether you're a smoker, whether you've got a family history, whether you've got high blood pressure, and then the cholesterol profile is not determined by total cholesterol alone or even LDL, it's your total cholesterol divided by your HDL, so-called good cholesterol ratio. What saturated fat does, just on that, if we just focus on that for a second, it raises HDL as well as having differential effects on LDL. And therefore, the overall effect on the lipid profile from the risk calculator perspective is neutral, right? So I'm not saying saturated fat is beneficial for the heart. I'm not saying it's bad for the heart. Of course, you can have foods that are nutritious for other reasons. So that's what we determined from the cholesterol profile. The next question is, does lowering cholesterol, LDL and total cholesterol, does it make a difference in preventing heart attacks and strokes? The conventional wisdom, Max, for a very long time amongst lipid specialists, amongst cardiologists still, is that there is this mantra that basically says for every 1 millimole per liter that you lower LDL cholesterol, there's a 20% risk reduction in cardiovascular events, heart attack, stroke, hospital admissions, that kind of thing. Myself was very skeptical, having looked at a lot of misinformation that was being perpetuated by drug industry and scientists who were funded by them. Myself and two cardiologists actually in 2020, in fact, 2019 or 2020, I can't remember now, we published a paper before the pandemic where we did a systematic review and we looked at all of the drug trials. Forget about saturated fat for a second, because the effect of diet on cholesterol actually is quite minimal when it comes to LDL and total cholesterol in general. It's very minimal. The drugs have a much more profound effect. So we thought, okay, let's look at the drug trials. Is this true? Looking at all the evidence from randomized trials to see, does lowering LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, is there a clear correlation with reduction in heart attacks, strokes, etc., and death? And we found there was no clear correlation. It was bunkum.
And we're talking statin drugs specifically?
Well, statins were part of it, but other drugs that have come in, newer drugs, because this is a huge market. You've got to understand that the market around the fear of cholesterol, is whether it's diet or drugs, we're talking $1 trillion industry here.
Big business.
So overcoming that, people understand why are they being misled, or how can it's so obvious. It's because a lot of people make a lot of money from flawed, old research, etc., and it hasn't been updated. And what they do is they fight to try and continue that narrative for as long as possible. So in this process, of course, me being someone that's published on this in peer-reviewed medical journals. I mean, this paper we publish is in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine, so people can look that up. But also, I'm somebody that I don't just publish for the sake of publishing. I think there's something important people need to know about their health, and I need to get it out there. And therefore, I've been pretty successful in getting almost all of my published articles, research into mainstream media, into the news, whether it's UK news, international news. And for the drug industry, that's obviously, something they want to avoid because, when the truth gets out, then obviously it affects their profit margins and all that kind of stuff. The harmful side of this cholesterol lowering is that what has happened is as you know, it's encouraged all this obsession with low-fat foods, which automatically means you eat more carbohydrates. Now, if you're eating non-processed carbohydrates, not so much of a big deal. But the refined carbs, the sugars, etc., which we know has increased significantly in terms of consumption for the last 2 or 3 decades, is also then linked to type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, which is actually the most important risk factor, if you like, for heart disease in the first place. So paradoxically, and I've wrote about this in the BMJ, the obsession with lowering cholesterol has probably increased heart attack risk.
Well, because it's like the demonization of fat and cholesterol, which are found in any saturated fat is found in any natural fat containing food. And of course, cholesterol is found in animal products, which tend to, aside from the cholesterol that they may contain lots of other nutrients like protein. And so the demonization of these foods, I feel like, has opened the door to all manner of ultra processed foods, now able to make any type of health claim. You see the red heart healthy logo whenever you stroll, a modern supermarket. And it's like those products that we're starting to see now are associated with cardiovascular disease, dementia, all cause mortality and the like.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. The focus should really be, I think, on a population level, even for individuals, is reducing ultra-processed food consumption, because that is 60% of the calories consumed in the American diet, 50% of the calories in the UK diet. It's unbelievable. And a lot of these foods are marketed as being healthy, right?
Yeah.
So I basically tell my patients, if it comes out of a packet and has 5 or more ingredients, usually with additives and preservatives, don't eat it because it's ultra-processed food. That's essentially the criteria for classification of ultra-processed food.
This episode of the show is sponsored by House of Macadamias. I'm a huge fan of macadamia nuts, but they've always been cost prohibitive. They've always been the most premium and expensive nut. That's why I'm super glad that House of Macadamias is now making macadamia nuts easily accessible to all. They've partnered with farmers in South Africa to democratize macadamia nuts, making macadamia nuts finally affordable. Macadamias are incredible. They're super high in healthy monounsaturated fat. They are vegan, keto, and paleo approved. And House of Macadamias makes all kinds of macadamia-based products. You can get dry roasted macadamias, which are my personal favorite. They come in a myriad of different flavors, like zesty salsa flavor. They are 10 out of 10 delicious. And if you go to houseofmacadamias.com and use promo code MAX, you'll get 20% off of your order. Thank you so much, House of Macadamias, for sponsoring this episode of the show. Is it possible, though, that has the pendulum swung possibly too far in the other direction, though, now, where obviously the demonization of fat was unwarranted, but now you see a lot of people, particularly on social media, where, let's be real, today a lot of people get their nutritional information from social media, where now people are advocating for the consumption of very fatty meat, industrially raised meat that has excess fat in general, and then a higher proportion of saturated fat, and in particular saturated fatty acids that might not necessarily be neutral from a lipid standpoint. Is it possible that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, or no?
I don't think so yet, Max, but I know what you're saying. I think there is, I think we have to
where's the happy medium, the middle line?
No, sure. I think we have to avoid nutritional zealotry. So I know that there are different diets that work for different people. For example, I have patients that benefit from a carnivore diet. Would I recommend carnivore diet to everybody? No, I wouldn't. These people have got to that stage when other things haven't worked for them, right? But I think the happy medium would be actually really just going back to just eating real food. And I think if you're getting, first of all, are you getting all your nutritional requirements, right, from food? You want to ideally be eating diet which is requiring you not to take supplements, right? Ideally, if you have a healthy, balanced diet, you don't really need supplements. I mean, I'm all for evidence-based stuff like vitamin D and all that kind of stuff, and even magnesium for people with stress and all that. Definitely some good and no harm, or very little clear harm. So I think we need to go back, pick the low-hanging fruit, ultra-processed food. People will have different preferences, values. Some people will be vegetarian. Some people will be happy eating meat. But I think that you're talking about some of these industrial mass-produced meat products that are full of hormones and that kind of stuff. Intuitively, that doesn't sound like a very good idea in terms of diet. Absolutely not.
Yeah. I love the distinction that you made earlier between, people with familial hyperlipidemia. I guess in the US we call that hypercholesterolemia, right?
Yes.
Or is it?
Yeah, same. It's interchangeable.
Interchangeable, yeah. And people who develop, I suppose, sporadic heart disease that don't have necessarily those genetic mutations. Because to me, it's like the difference between somebody who develops early onset familial Alzheimer's disease and late onset sporadic. They're like different animals.
Yeah.
They're not to be treated as one and the same, but you're saying they actually do that for cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, they do. They treat everybody the same in that sense, thinking that, the approach in managing heart disease for many cardiologists is that they think that the primary driver is cholesterol, and to lower it is the best way forward. But that's not true. Having said that, does that mean statins don't work? No, it doesn't. It's interesting. So when I was trying to figure out and putting the jigsaw together, if lowering cholesterol doesn't reduce heart attacks and strokes, how do statins work? Statins do have a small benefit, but the way they have their benefit is because they have other properties which are anti-inflammatory and anti-clotting. And that's likely where they exert their benefit. Although, again, most people aren't told that if you're at low risk of heart disease, then your benefit from a statin is at best about 1%, right, in preventing a heart attack over a 5-year period. If you've had a heart attack, it's higher. It's about 2.5%. In other words, 1 in 39 chance of preventing a non-fatal heart attack, and 1 in 83 in terms of mortality benefit. Again, best case scenario, this is industry-sponsored studies where people with side effects are taken out of the trials quite often. So what I tell my patients when I have a conversation with them, a kind of informed decision-making conversation, I say, if you take this drug religiously and you don't get side effects, best case scenario, 1 in 39 benefit for you for preventing a heart attack and 1 in 83 for prolonging your life. So that's really where the statins thing comes in. But to conclude on this particular part of the chat, Max, I do not place lowering cholesterol whatsoever as part of my management plan in anybody who is trying to prevent heart disease or anybody with heart disease. And that includes familial hyperlipidemia, right? So what we also found, I published research with a number of international scientists. With FH, what's interesting is they're also not the same. They're all not the same. So 70% of women and 50% of men will not develop premature heart disease with FH if they're left untreated. So the question is, can we differentiate those groups of people? And we can. And it isn't to do with LDL.
So even if you have FH, you're not destined to...
No, I have many patients that come to me, right, who are diagnosed for the first time with FH. I'll give you an example. In fact, I wrote about this. So I had 3 consecutive women over a period of about a year and a half in their 50s who came to me, had FH diagnosis, picked up for the first time, which, by the way, is genetic. So they would have had it since childhood. And they were fit and healthy. They were slim. Some of them were kind of relatively low-carb diets. They were active. They were in great shape. And this blood test, they'd got scared by their doctor and essentially told, unless they went on a statin or lowered their cholesterol, their prognosis was like someone with terminal cancer. So you can understand they were really scared, but they didn't make sense to them. So they came to me for a second opinion. And I said to them, listen, well, first of all, basically, the data shows if you have FH and your insulin levels are low and your waist circumference is normal, your relative risk, your risk of a heart attack or developing heart disease, even in middle age, is only slightly higher than the healthiest person in the population. Very slightly high. That's it. So, it's almost the same. So what I did with these patients, I said, listen, to reassure you properly, why don't we carry out something called a CT coronary angiogram? That's an imaging test that actually looks at the coronary arteries. Because I said, if high cholesterol has been a problem for you, which you've had for decades, or since you were born, you're going to have some heart disease now. It might be severe, right? Might be a little bit less, but you will have heart disease.
That's what I would expect.
Completely normal, all of them. Pristine, completely clear coronary arteries. These people had normal triglycerides and HDL, which is another part of the cholesterol profile, which is a marker for insulin resistance. So they fulfill the criteria for having no insulin resistance, being really well. No, they didn't have high blood pressure. They didn't have diabetes. Clear arteries. Thank you very much. You don't need a statin. You don't need to lower your cholesterol. Off you go.
Wow. But what about, like lipidologists, wouldn't they say that just the more of these lipoproteins, the higher the particle number, the higher your ApoB that you have in circulation. It's just the higher the risk that any one of these particles is going to get embedded in the...
Yeah, it's theory, and it's comes from a place of trying to... What I always tell people when I teach medical, even though it's medical school, I teach medical students, medicine is not an exact science. It never has been. It's an applied science. It's not like physics or chemistry. A lot of it's an art, and it's based upon probabilities. But the problem is we get many doctors, and I know this is a big issue in the US, they take a biomarker, which has got maybe some association somewhere with risk, and then they think automatically that altering that biomarker will lower the risk, and often with drugs. But the only way to really prove that, Max, is with a double-blinded randomized control trial where you actually follow those people up by altering the biomarker and showing that outcomes are improved. So I'm very skeptical of just jumping in and saying, lipoprotein(a) is high. Okay, we must do something to lower it. Because there is no evidence, certainly, that I know of, where if you lower it, it does have a big impact. Even if it does, you then got to get into the equation of, okay, well, if we change your lipoprotein(a) with this drug, there's a 1 in 100 chance it's going to benefit you. So patients need to know that. But then they'll say, well, what else can I do, doc? Well, let's talk about your diet. Let's talk about your exercise. Let's talk about your sleep and your stress. 80% of heart disease is environmental and lifestyle based upon those factors. Your diet, whether you're sedentary, and psychosocial stress. Of course, smoking is still a big issue for many people, and developing countries as well, so we shouldn't ignore that. Those are the real big risk factors. And if you address those optimally, you're going to be in the best shape that you can be, and hopefully avoid having to ever go on a pill, which come with side effects and, and interfere with the quality of life with a lot of people.
Well, what if somebody presents to you, a patient that ticks, any number of boxes for metabolic syndrome. They've got, high LDL, but they're insulin resistant. They've got, lots of visceral adiposity.
Yeah.
And they're resistant to lifestyle change.
Well,
what do you do in that situation?
It's interesting. I give them all the information. With me, I've actually rarely, in fact, I think this is a bit of a myth. I don't think I've ever I can't think of me coming across a patient like that. And one of the reasons for this is, I think, because I explain to patients, I tell them, listen, these are what the drugs do. Of course, there are potential side effects. This is what the lifestyle changes do. But I think what maybe helps me a little bit more in convincing those patients to at least give it a go is the other interesting and important, impactful message on dietary changes and lifestyle, but dietary in particular, is that you can reverse metabolic syndrome in 3 weeks of pure dietary change in about 50% of patients.
Wow.
So I tell patients, this is not a long-term, just do this for a few weeks, because a lot of them, obviously, listen, it's a big deal for a lot of people, right? It's changing their habits, etc. But I say, listen, will you do me a favor? Can you do this for a month? Just be disciplined for me for a month. And most of them say yes. And they come back after a month and they're like, wow, I feel like a new person. Like, I can't believe this. I cut sugar from my diet or whatever else. I can, So that's what my approach is. But yes, if patients are resistant, you still have to tell them in an honest way what the benefits of the drugs are. And when you tell them the benefits of the drugs, most of them don't think they're very good, and they decide they don't want to take the pill, and that's fine. That's ethical, evidence-based medical practice. On every letter I write for my patient, I say I support this patient's decision if they decide to take a statin or not take a statin. As long as I tell them the information in the way that they can understand, I will say I support their decision in keeping with the principles of ethical, evidence-based medical practice. The problem, Max, is, I can tell you this now, 99.99% of doctors around the world are not doing that.
Yeah, it's crazy. You also have to, it's like what, 1 in 39 is the probability that it's actually going to, do anything helpful for you?
In people who've had a heart attack already, are the highest risk people.
Oh, so for secondary prevention. What about for primary prevention?
Primary prevention, listen, 1 in 100 for benefit of it, so preventing a non-fatal heart attack or non-fatal stroke with no mortality benefit. Now, if people are listening, there's a great website which is developed by independent doctors who are not linked to the drug industry. Almost every analysis they do goes through peer review, and it covers many interventions in medicine, like blood pressure pills, diabetes stuff, everything. And they have all of this on their website. It's called thennt.com. So,
and what does NNT stand for?
Numbers needed to treat. So you have to treat 100 people for one to benefit from a statin in low-risk people in preventing a non-fatal heart attack or stroke. And they also talk about the best evidence on side effects. And they actually have a traffic light system. So they'll say green, benefits outweigh the harms clearly. Yellow, it's a bit debatable. Black, the harms outweigh the benefits.
Wow.
And it covers everything even from heart stents. I actually published on one of their sites on heart stents as well. So it's a really great resource, and it's accurate, and it's evidence-based, and it can't be contested.
Wow. So 100 people need to take a statin drug on a daily
for 5 years.
For 5 years.
Yeah.
For one person.
Yeah. And that's probably best case scenario, Max, because that information is derived predominantly from drug industry sponsored trials where they hold onto the raw data, they keep it commercially confidential. It's never been independently verified. This is something I've campaigned on for years, especially on side effects. And therefore, what we do know is the way that trials are designed is often these drug trials involving tens of thousands of people will choose participants that are less likely to get side effects. So we call the results of this in the trial efficacy, right? But effectiveness is actually what happens in the population. So on that note, what's really interesting is, and I've also written about this in my book, so if people want to read more about it in detail, my book is called Statin Free Life, and you can look at that. It's available on Amazon. Is that they looked across Europe, this is published in the BMJ, to see over a period of around 20 years, had statins reduced death rates from heart disease in the population of the increase in statins, right? Both in low risk and high risk people. And they found there was no reduction in death rates from heart disease from statin prescriptions over about 2 decades, right? Wow. And so the question is, why is that? There's another way of looking at the statistics. And this again is industry-sponsored trials and analyzing how much on average do people live longer over a 5-year period taking a statin. If you're highest risk, your median increase in life expectancy from that, from those trials, that's people who've had heart attacks, over a 5-year period is just over 4 days.
4 days?
Right? 4 days. And that's from the industry-sponsored trials and where people who took the statins. In the real world, Max, many people, probably about 50% within a few years of taking a statin will stop taking it. And when you ask them why, from surveys they say because they got side effects. So for me, I was trying to calculate mathematically and just logically, why is there no decrease in cardiovascular death rates attributed to statin prescription? It's because the benefits in terms of increasing life expectancy are only quite minor, a few days potentially. And that's from the trial data where people took the statins. In the real world, half of the patients are stopping them anyway. You can explain why there's no significant reduction in cardiovascular mortality in the population from statins. In a way, Max, to be honest, and a lot of people would be shocked hearing this, we're talking about one of the most lucrative drugs in the history of medicine. And that's how beneficial it is. It's basically not that great, to be polite.
Wow. And it's like the top selling class of drugs globally now, right?
Yeah.
Big business.
But, on that note, just to take a step back for a second, if we take this example of statins, you look at American healthcare, right? And unfortunately, you have one of the highest expenditures in the world, over $4 trillion spent on healthcare. We know that 20 to 50% of all healthcare activity in the US brings no benefit to patients. A lot of it because a lot of the prescriptions and procedures and things that are expensive have very marginal benefits at best and often don't have benefits. And you've now got to a situation, Max, in the US where you're having a life expectancy that's reduced. In the last few years, it's reduced to 79 years. So, and this is, being replicated in other parts of the world. Britain is not doing that much better. But what does that mean? Our health is regressing despite so-called modern medical science.
Yeah, that's sad. And what are the most common side effects of statin drugs?
Listen, I think the first thing to say is that most people, the side effects are not life-threatening or serious, but they are quality of life limiting, and that's important. And the most common one is fatigue and muscle aches. So that's what we see most common. But it can also cause people to have stomach problems, memory disturbance. A lot of people get diagnosed sometimes that they may have dementia. And in fact, it was a statin.
Wow.
They stop the statin and their mental clarity returns. I know of bed-bound elderly patients who have been on statins for years. Statin gets stopped, they start walking again. I mean, you can have quite dramatic effects you can see when you stop people taking them off their statins.
At the onset of I don't know if you know this, but my mother had dementia, and that's the reason why I stepped my foot out and started advocating for nutrition and positive lifestyle change. But at the onset of her memory problems, and I'm not claiming that this is what caused them. I have no idea. But she was on a statin drug at the time, which was there's a continuum of what's called like lipo, how lipophilic a statin is, right? And that sort of influences its predisposition to enter into the brain and affect the cholesterol producing machinery in the brain. And the brain is home to 25% of the body's cholesterol. Total body cholesterol is located in the brain. And so it would stand to reason that a drug that's messing with that machinery would have some kind of impingement on brain health and brain function.
Absolutely.
And so she was on one of those drugs at the time. And if I recall correctly, it was one of the more lipophilic statin drugs. And soon after that, she stopped taking it. But her dementia continued to progress. It's very sad that so many people are that is the front line of defense. So what would be like the front line of defense for you? I mean, is it like just cleaning up one's diet, exercising more? What does that even look like?
I mean, absolutely. Normally when my patients come to me, they often will have metabolic. In fact, all of my patients will, almost all of them cardiac-wise, will have probably metabolic syndrome. So, and again, the best way to manage metabolic syndrome, there is no drug for it. You can treat individual risk factors, you can do the blood pressure pills, etc. And of course, there is a role, and I will look carefully to see, are these people in a very high risk category where they are going to get a more benefit from a pill? For example, blood pressure is one of them, which I think is certainly what we call moderate to severe high blood pressure, definitely has a significant benefit from blood pressure lowering pills. But most people aren't in that category, and therefore you can adjust their lifestyle and reduce their blood pressure. Again, it comes down to, so what I'll do is my default has been for heart disease patients, a low carb Mediterranean diet. So we know, I published a paper in 2017, which actually, became a big news story. It was in one of the BMJ journals, British Journal of Sports Medicine. Two of my co-authors are actually very eminent cardiologists, both editors of medical journals. Rita Redberg, who is the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine. She's based in San Francisco. And Pascal Meyer, who's the editor of BMJ Open Heart. And the title of, you'd love the title, of this article, which was, I think it broke the record for the journal for that year. It was like more than 1 million downloads, which is kind of unheard of in medical journal terms, was saturated fat does not clog the arteries. Coronary artery disease, it's a very long title, is a chronic inflammatory condition that can be managed with lifestyle changes. And we have a diagram in there, and people look, there's like almost like a cartoon picture showing the arteries and them being inflamed, and what are the different components that lead to heart disease. And the two big things are insulin resistance and chronic inflammation. Heart disease is a chronic inflammatory condition. So part of the management for heart disease on lifestyle is tackling insulin resistance, but also chronic inflammation. There's a lot of overlap. But what drives, what can be an antidote, if you like, to chronic inflammation from a diet point of view, is an anti-inflammatory diet. So these are components of the Mediterranean diet that are thought to be beneficial, which are extra virgin olive oil, omega-3 fatty acids from oily fish, nuts and seeds, polyphenols from whole fruit and vegetables. So I always tell my patients, I want this to be the core of your diet. I want you to eliminate or minimize your refined sugars and carbohydrates, right? And the rest of the time, I don't care what else you eat. If you want to have a steak 3 times a week, go for it. I mean, honestly, you can see that they're really happy about that kind of stuff. And actually, then they do this, and I wrote a book and then about it as well. and then they, you see their metabolic syndrome get better. You see them improve their quality of life, everything else. So that's the main dietary approach that I use, Max.
But that's not controversial.
Yeah. Well,
why has it become so controversial?
I think because of because it's not focused on cholesterol lowering. And if it's not focused on cholesterol lowering, it's controversial. But actually, their cholesterol profile tends to improve because their triglycerides get better and the HDL gets better. So actually, their overall cholesterol profile improves. And then I also focus on the exercise thing. It's interesting because I think there's also a big problem, the pendulum swinging the other way, with people overtraining. About 11% of elite athletes by middle age will have calcium scores over 1,000. Severe, like what would be normally marked as severe coronary artery disease. I think for a certain proportion of people, overtraining causes extra stress on the coronary arteries. I'm not saying to tell these people to not exercise. I think do what you enjoy, but just be wary you're not overdoing it. But the point I want to make is, when you look at the studies in terms of longevity and heart disease, really just a brisk walk for 30 minutes a day, maybe a couple of times a day if need be, from a longevity perspective is probably ideal. And you look at the blue zones, these guys weren't hitting it in the gym.
That's fair. Some of us are meatheads, though.
No, I know. And I get that. And that's fine. So do what you enjoy, but just be wary, like understand why you're doing it.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily going to be the best thing for your heart. No, you might be fine, but I'm just saying that you don't need to... There's no dose response with exercise after a certain level. Let's put it that way.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that's all I want to say. And also, it helps empower a lot of people that maybe can't, I don't know, they're busy, they can't afford to go to a gym or whatever, right? Yeah. So it's easy. Walking is something everybody can do, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing to say. And then the one big missing factor, I think, which again is where we are going as we move forward in terms of, I think there will be a greater shift, hopefully, is the management of psychosocial stress or psychological stress. Almost every single one of my patients will have stress levels that are quite high. And we know now, which we didn't know maybe 10 years ago, of the plausible biological mechanism of how chronic stress causes heart disease. And it's through the fact that it increases chronic inflammatory markers in the blood and thrombotic factors. And we know this from studies that have been done. There was a study published in The Lancet where they took MRI scans of the brain, and they were able to look at amygdala activity, which is like the emotion center, and correlate the subjective stress of the person with the amygdala activity with biomarkers in the blood, which are associated with inflammation. And it was almost perfect correlation.
Wow.
And that, to give it perspective, chronic psychological stress, which a lot of us, maybe most of the population is suffering from now, as a risk factor for heart disease and heart attack is the same as being either a smoker or having high blood pressure or having type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
But most people are not managing it properly, Max. So I actually get my patients to say, listen, you need to really do something. Think about the roots of the stress. two most common causes of stress for people are work and relationship stress,
Hmm.
right? So can you, if is your job, is there something you can do to change your job if it's a real, because it's killing you slowly, right? Can you do something there? What's going on with your relationships, right? Think about that kind of stuff. And in fact, actually, you may laugh at this, with a lot of the cardiac patients, they come with their wives. And I actually tell them, I actually prescribe hugging. I actually tell them they need to start like hugging more and spending longer time hugging, right?
Love that.
So yeah, meditation is very powerful. So it's interesting. One of the best bits of data on heart disease reversal, which again most cardiologists think is not possible, but it does happen. Maybe we haven't sussed out exactly how it happens yet. Comes from India, and the single biggest driver in that study called the Mount Abu Heart Trial, published in the early 2000s. And I know the cardiologist that did it. He's a legit guy. The single biggest driver of reversal of heart disease from a lifestyle plan that he put his patients on who had significant heart disease was 40 minutes of something called Raj Yoga meditation a day.
Wow.
Almost independent of diet, independent of exercise.
What does that method look like? Do you know?
It's a very deep kind of meditation. It involves also some level of counseling with, and it involves basically like, they go a bit deeper than just the breathing and the deep meditation stuff. They look at what's going on with your relationships, your social circle. Can you improve that kind of stuff? Like, can you be in a situation where you're getting more nourishment from those relationships? So they go a bit deeper into that.
People definitely underappreciate that chronic stress can have a measurable impact, like a physiologic impact on your biology. Increases blood sugar, thrombotic factors.
Absolutely.
It's nuts.
Drives more unhealthy behaviors indirectly.
Wow.
Right? Because if you're chronically stressed, you're more likely to, go for the comfort foods, junk food, that kind of thing.
Wow.
And I think that the common denominator of the blue zones is they had a very strong sense of community. So people who have good community, good relationships, good quality relationships, that's actually a protector from these external stresses.
They probably spend less time on social media.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Social media is driving heart disease.
Probably.
I feel like this is a mass public experiment. I feel like decades from now, we're going to see the stress wrought by our over exposure to these.
There's a great book actually I read on that, 10 Reasons to Delete a Social Media Account, by a guy called Jaron Lanier in the States. Is it like a tech entrepreneur? It is just absolutely mind-blowing. As in, the case that he makes for deleting social media accounts is so strong. But one of the things he says on relation to what you just brought up, Max, is that social media, unfortunately, brings out some of the worst in human behavior. And you get trolling and people get angry. And he talks about the fact that one of the reasons is that it brings out attention-seeking behavior, because that's how you increase your, by doing something that's attention-seeking, you increase your profile or likes, whatever else. It brings normal people that maybe don't have a platform to give them a voice, they think. And often that means, and he puts this actually literally, he says it encourages people to behave like assholes. So he says that it's attention acquisition. The algorithm almost has been created to serve attention acquisition, leading to asshole supremacy.
Well, asshole supremacy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You are spearheading, I think, a very important conversation here in the UK, and obviously, when you're at the forefront of any potentially polarizing conversation, I mean, you get your share of social media haters. How do you? I asked you this when I bumped into you for the first time at the conference this past weekend. How do you look after your mental health? Like when you're at the forefront of all the many different topics that you're talking about.
Okay, well, on the social media side, one of the things I do actually, which I've been doing quite effectively, I think, for quite a while, is if there is somebody there that is coming at you with not good intentions, they are being abusive or whatever else, I just instantly block. And what happens is you get the same people, I found, because sometimes I've been contacting people saying, oh my God, Aseem, how are you doing? I've seen all the trolling on your latest tweet. And I'm like, what trolling? I'd blocked all those guys. I'm not seeing it.
I love it.
And that's actually good advice for everybody, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think you can mute them or whatever, right? So I think that will reduce that level of stress. For me, as an activist, as a doctor, I am wedded to my conviction that I know that I am doing things for the purposes of relieving suffering of my patients, for the truth, for transparency, from a place of integrity. That empowers me. And that means that I have maybe created... Listen, it's not easy, believe me. I've had my stressful moments in the last decade for sure, right? Social media is one side, but the other thing is all the public smearing, whatever else that can happen, and people trying to attack your credibility, especially industry. But I think, created a resilience veil where the truth is so empowering that it kind of, you can deflect a lot of this stuff, I think.
Do you, if you were like American, if you were in the States, would you get as much flack? Because I feel like with nutrition, from my vantage point, the UK, and I love being. I mean, I've had an amazing time. So this is no shade against England, but like I find that nutritionally, it's a little bit behind the curve. You know, like we tend to be a lot more progressive in the US. Do you think like part of the pushback that you get is because you're here, you're English?
I'm not sure, Max. I haven't thought about that before. That you don't think there's not so much trolling and stuff? I mean, I see articles in the US where you've got the diet wars between the vegans and the carnivores and that kind of stuff, and that does get quite. It does seem to get quite nasty at times. So I don't know. It's difficult to. I think
you're kind of a big fish in a much smaller pond here.
Right.
Whereas in the US, there's a lot more fish. The pond is a lot bigger.
May well be the case. That could be the reason. Yeah. So you've probably got more people in the sense that there's a level of kind of protection from. So yeah. So in some ways, yeah. I mean, I was the cardiologist that 2013 wrote this paper in the BMJ, and it was international news saying that saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease, and yeah, it was. I'd committed heresy basically by saying that cardiac patients can eat butter again.
Yeah, well, because everything that you've said so far is very, very reasonable.
Yeah, but I was probably the only person actually, right, in the country doing that at that stage.
You mentioned blood pressure earlier on. Is it? Do you think like the importance of lowering blood pressure, is that less contentious?
Yeah, Max, I'm glad you raised that. So the biggest risk factor for death worldwide is actually high blood pressure, right? It's linked to strokes and heart attacks. And certainly when you look at blood pressure, well, this is the interesting thing. So if your average blood pressure is above 140 over 90, your systolic's 140 and 90, then you have mild hypertension. If it's above 160 over 100, on average it's moderate, and then 180 over 110 is severe. Oof. Right? Now, the interesting thing is your risk of stroke starts to go up, in a relatively linear way as soon as your blood pressure goes above 140 over 90 slightly. It goes and increases as a higher blood pressure. However, lowering blood pressure, if you're only mildly hypertensive with drugs, does not show any significant benefit in preventing heart attacks and strokes. So the question is, one of the issues I think with all these biomarkers is there are probably other associated markers in the blood or factors that aren't being measured and tackled that are going along with, say, high blood pressure, where the pill is treating the high blood pressure but not treating maybe the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of the problem, for example, even for blood pressure, 50% of cases is insulin resistance again. So that's probably why it doesn't have an effect in mild hypertension. With more severe, then it's, you get more bang for your buck in the sense that there's such a high risk of stroke. Any lowering at that stage is going to benefit you. So what I'm saying is there is a massive problem with people being overtreated for blood pressure as well with pills. And they're not being told that it's not going to have a significant effect at all at preventing heart attacks or strokes. So they've got the illusion of protection. And simultaneously, Max, if they're not being told to change their diet, then they're missing out on an opportunity to really lower their risk.
Of course. 50% of adults now have hypertension.
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
And we're seeing now more and more the evidence come out on how exercise is just as effective as drugs.
Exercise definitely has a role. I mean, what is amazing, actually, exercise definitely for sure, but more powerful than exercise for blood pressure is diet and meditation. So one of the fascinating things I refer to some of my patients to, who need more specialist help. I have this nurse I work with who's probably one of the best stress reduction therapists in the country, who's also a cardiac nurse. And she feeds back stuff to me with some of the patients I've gone to and said, Aseem, listen, so-and-so came. I did a bit of an assessment on her. She was under a lot of stress. We started the deep meditation, for like an hour. Her blood pressure started at 150 systolic pre-meditation, 110 at the end.
Wow.
I mean, it's going to vary, but I even notice that myself in the morning. I do meditation every morning, and you can see differences in blood pressure by even 20, 30 millimeters of mercury just by doing some deep breathing for a few minutes.
Deep breathing. Wow. Because
Yeah.
you're activating what, like your parasympathetic?
Parasympathetic, yeah, absolutely. And you can feel the heart rate slow down as well.
How long does it take? Like, what's the minimal effective dose of deep breathing?
Oh, listen, one of the things that's interesting, a lot of people don't measure their blood pressure correctly, so they get overdiagnosed. The gold standard for blood pressure is actually something called a 24-hour blood pressure monitor.
Hmm.
But it's a bit cumbersome. You got to have a blood pressure monitor kept all day and all night, and you sleep through it on. It keeps coming on and off, whatever.
Yeah, it sounds annoying.
But what we find is that a lot of people, when they check their blood pressure, when they check it, they're a bit stressed out. They're worried about the blood pressure, and it can raise the blood pressure.
White coat syndrome.
White coat
right?
syndrome,
Yeah.
see the doctor, right? So what we recommend, what I always tell my patients if they've got a home blood pressure monitor, is lie down and do some deep breathing and try and relax for just 2 or 3 minutes, then check it, and that's going to be the accurate reading.
People should have blood pressure monitors in their homes.
I think, yeah, listen, it's safe and it's cheap. You can get blood, certainly in the UK, you can get a blood pressure monitor, a digital one for about £40.
From a dietary standpoint, if somebody has hypertension or even pre-hypertension, like what are the big fish from a dietary standpoint?
Low carb.
Low carb.
Yeah, anything that raises insulin is going to raise blood pressure.
Because why? Because insulin, how does that work?
Insulin acts on the kidneys to retain more fluid, right? It works on these sodium potassium channels and it can retain fluid. Also, what insulin does is one of it affects the endothelial function. So these are the smallest cells, which is where heart disease develops, that line the coronary arteries, and a lot of our arteries are the endothelial cells that kind of they will be elastic. They'll change according to needs of the body in terms of exercise and whatever else.
Is this like heart rate variability?
Slightly different, but it can affect heart rate variability as well. So what they do is they damage the endothelial, the ability of they can over time reduce the elasticity of the blood vessels. And reduction in elasticity of the blood vessels is actually when people develop high blood pressure.
Wow.
And insulin is directly toxic, if you like. Too much insulin has an effect on there. So there's probably multiple mechanisms, but certainly the dietary approach would be that, and of course stress reduction, and exercise for sure. I mean, some regular moderate activity definitely is beneficial too.
I feel like most conventional cardiologists would be like, cut the salt.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't think for most people, salt is not an issue. So about 10% of the population are salt sensitive. And some of my patients, for sure, have got their blood pressure better when they reduce salt. Definitely. But for most people, it isn't a big deal. So it's not my primary approach to reduce salt. I would do these other things first and see what happens. And if it's resistant, then we will start looking at reducing salt.
Interesting.
Yeah.
At what stage in your career did you realize that your colleagues, or did you realize that you needed to speak out about some of the things that you were finding in your research and clinically?
It was a gradual process, I think, Max. I've always been someone that loved writing. So I think it's relevant because getting the information out there, a lot of it happened through my writing, at least provoking those conversations. I used to write for my school newspaper. Our school newspaper was like got the national award for the best school newspaper of the year, whatever else, Daily
That's
Telegraph
awesome.
Prize. And I had an article in the prize-winning issue. So I used to love writing. I got a lot of that from my dad. My dad was a prolific writer, retired GP. I think I got that gene from him. We call it power of the pen. And then I started writing in medical journals, probably the BMJ. The first piece I wrote in the BMJ was early 2013, where I'd done an investigation on sugar and realized that the dietary advice on sugar had been manipulated, surprise, by the food industry, where everyone in Europe were basically being told they should be consuming 22.5 teaspoons of sugar a day on the guideline. And I realized it was all manipulation by food industry, right?
Wow.
So I published this investigation. I started writing about it. But I'd started, I think, a bit earlier, 2011. I published an article in the Observer newspaper. For me, a lot of the stuff started with hospital food environment. Like we had an obesity epidemic. Why are we serving junk food to patients? Why is half of the NHS employees, doctors and nurses, are overweight or obese? It's like we need to start in our own backyard. What the hell's going on here? So I think I started probably around then to start writing initially, but really motivated with a sense of real concern that my patients were getting a bad deal, right? These people were coming in, they were sick. We were seeing more and more people since I qualified as a doctor, with chronic disease, more pills, population health not improving, more stress on the system. I kind of thought, hold on a minute, if we carry on as we are, our healthcare service systems are going to collapse. We're going to fail to provide consistent, high quality care to people in emergencies. And we've seen that happen. Both my mom and my dad were victims, they both died because of that, because of failures in the system where even emergency care was delayed. So, and I never predicted that would happen to my own parents. And that was, when I started this campaign, 12, 13 years ago. So because of that foresight, Max, I then felt I had to speak out. And that's just the way I'm built. That's just me. You know, I can't hold on to this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I know it's not safe to speak the truth, but I kind of see, I look at it rationally. It's less safe to not speak the truth. When you realize something's going on and it's wrong, and you know, my duty is to patients, and it's like, I'm going to throw the kitchen sink at it.
That's how I feel. I think that's around the time when we met, when you were first getting started.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super powerful. And obviously the past 2 years have, you know, there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of like
Yes.
a lot of, you know, cooks in the kitchen viewpoints that you know, that contentious viewpoints about any you know, I mean, I guess like the vaccine stuff and all that, and you've been a very like outspoken advocate on behalf of critical thought where that's concerned,
Well,
mandates and
yeah.
the like.
And I think, you know, unfortunately, not enough doctors are open to discussing the fact that if new information comes to light or evidence changes, they have to change with the evidence, right? And they feel, I don't know, maybe not secure in having those conversations, but part of good medical practice and being a doctor is changing when the evidence changes, right? So as in your approach, in fact, we're taught in medical school, 50% of what you learn will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation.
Wow.
The trouble is nobody can tell you which half, so you have to learn on your own. And I wish more of my colleagues and more people would accept. And that also comes back to the fact that, again, medicine is not an exact science. It's an applied science. It's an art as much as it is to some degree uses scientific principles in its approach. I think that's also really, it's a cultural issue we have. And that means that a lot of doctors aren't critically thinking, as you said, and saying, well, hold on a minute, you know, this cholesterol hypothesis was, whatever, 50 years ago. Do we think it's correct? Is there other data now to confirm that it was correct, or is there stuff that's contradicting it? You know, and how did we get it wrong? And you can actually rationalize it and figure out how all this happened. I think a lot of this was well intentioned, but the information emerged. We got better data, better information in terms of how we should manage heart disease patients, and we haven't caught up. I mean, collectively, I've been campaigning on it, been publishing on it, trying to influence guidelines, trying to call out. A lot of it is just, you know, manipulations and too much power of these big, powerful corporate entities, right? Over universities, over scientists, over clinical guidelines. And their primary motive is only to make profit, and they have no motivation. They may sell you this idea, but they have no motivation in making people healthier. They want to get as many people on as many drugs for as long as possible, Max. That is how they make money.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to have that conversation.
Of course. I mean, you watch any primetime newscast in the United States, I don't know how it is here, but it's like every ad is for a different drug. It's like every ad. And it's just shocking. I mean, they will highlight the purported benefits of whatever drug it is that the ad is for, and then a laundry list of side effects. But, you know, I think, you know, some
But it
people...
clearly works
Yeah,
to get the drugs out there, even though they must have figured out that,
Yeah.
that having the side effects for a very short time and then promoting it. And psychologically, they were doing all these studies to see, does it still mean that the consumer is going to want to have that pill?
But it is problematic, and it's naive to assume that the media hasn't, at least in some way, been captured by the entities that are paying their bills. And so it's led a lot of people, I think, to whether it's like the victim mindset or lose their sense of agency.
Yeah.
And then they show up at their doctor's appointments and they want the drug. So, yeah, I mean, I appreciate your work, you know. I mean, I definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
So what's next? What's next for you? I mean,
Yeah. So, you know, I told you we did the Big Fat Fix, and we were quite happy with the way that it went. It premiered, you know, the documentary I made a few years ago with Donal. You know, we premiered it in British Parliament. It influenced a lot of politicians to help sugar reduction policies. I was considered the lead campaigner behind the soda tax in this country.
Oh, amazing.
And that came about, a lot of it, because of that movie. And
has that helped? Has that brought like sugar consumption down?
Well, it has come down a little bit, but you know what I think, Max, to be honest, as the information has evolved, I think we've realized now that the next step, the more important step, is the ultra processed food.
Yeah.
And of course, sugar comes into that as well.
Yeah.
You know, sugary drinks is one thing, but there's still added sugar in all these foods, right? So that we still have to focus on that and push that. So I think it has had an effect, but we won't necessarily see it for a few years. But I think we need to go further. And then so we co-produced that, and we got decent coverage. I mean, BBC World News covered it. It was mentioned in New York Times, etc. So now we're on to our next one. And the title is called, we're actually in the middle of the crowdfunding right now. and it's called First Do No Farm, as in PHARM. And we really want to just unravel for people all of the root causes of an over-medicated society, covering a lot of these topics we've discussed today, and offer solutions moving forward. And a lot of those solutions are really is removal of conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest over clinical decision making. It's the very basic sort of understanding of what the film is about. But at the same time, we're going to also show how, with lifestyle changes and some great case studies, how powerful things like diet and stress reduction and exercise can be for people's health and quality of life. I mean, that's one thing. It's like we're all going to die at some point, but we want to live for as long as possible, as well as possible, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that these pills don't do, even if they may, blood pressure pills or diabetes drugs or cholesterol-lowering drugs, even if they may add some slight benefit for you, the one thing they don't do is improve your quality of life. In fact, the only thing they can do, if you're unlucky enough to get side effects, is worsen your quality of life. That doesn't tend to happen with lifestyle changes. It's the opposite.
Oh yeah, lifestyle change. I mean, in so many ways, improves your quality of life. You know, like it's like there's a spillover effect where just adhering to a new healthy habit, you know, gives you agency in other areas of your life, which is
100%.
so crucial. I definitely I started to have migraines last year. I relied on, you know, there was a time when I was very grateful to have like migraine aborting drugs at my disposal. My father just had a total knee replacement in one knee. So I'm not like anti-medicine or anything like that, but it's just, and I don't get that you are either.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah, it's too much medicine.
Right. Polypharmacy, right? It's a big problem.
100%.
For especially
we just have to shift the balance where, you know, it's first do no farm doesn't mean it's first do no farm, right? So it should be a secondary thing, right? Lifestyle first, pharmacotherapy second if required.
Yeah.
The problem is the current model is the other way around. In fact, it's not even introducing lifestyle, and even the lifestyle stuff that people are being told is still, a lot of it's nonsense. Lower your cholesterol, you can go on a low-fat diet. Right? So
yeah. And in the US, I don't know about here in the UK, but there's this big push towards like plant-based diets. There's like, you know, non-dairy milk replacements and things like that. It's like they're trying to push again. It seems like we've come full circle in a way where, you know, over the past couple of decades, we've done really great, you know, advocates such as yourself, activists such as yourself, done great work to welcome animal products back to the table. And now I feel like we've almost like regressed in a way. I was at Expo West. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's like in North America, it's like the largest natural foods and products expo that happens every year. The big theme this year was plant-based, like everything. Like they're now making plant-based fish, plant-based chicken.
Oh,
yeah.
That doesn't sound very good.
No.
Ugh.
Why do you think why do you think that is? This like health halo?
Yeah, so this is the other interesting thing. I think the ultra processed food industry also saw it as an opportunity to exploit this climate change link. Right? It's multifactorial. There are people that genuinely still think that the cholesterol hypothesis is true, and therefore lowering cholesterol is, but you know, so it fits with a few different narratives, and therefore it's it's an opportunity to make money, and I think that's probably where it's come from. You know, but on the climate change stuff, we know that there's hardly any association with meat consumption and climate change anyway. I mean, I wrote an article about this, and you know, it was independent research showed that if, let's say that every American citizen became vegan, right, the effect on greenhouse gases or whatever else would be about a 2% reduction, but you'd simultaneously worsen nutritional deficiencies, right, because it's not, you know, and probably obesity and chronic disease.
Wow.
And that's if every single American went vegan. So, you know, it's not, and it wasn't going to reduce heart disease either. So I'm not quite sure what the purpose is.
Also, meat consumption has gone down. I mean, the American people are largely currently on plant-based diets.
Right. Yeah.
They're very plant-forward diets.
Well, yeah, sure.
So I mean, what, like diluting the Western diet of protein even further?
Yeah, I know.
Is going to lead to positive health outcomes?
Doesn't make sense. Listen, I think you can have a healthy plant-based diet if it's real food. And and that's the key, right? But again, most people who are on these plant-based diets are eating ultra-processed food.
Yeah. So really, I mean, it comes back again and again to reducing the amount of ultra-processed food in your diet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And minimizing low-quality carbohydrates.
Yeah.
You know, your starches, basically, your breads and your pastas and your rice and all that kind of stuff.
Are you an advocate for, like, ketogenic diets?
I support their use in certain people. I have a few patients who do amazing on them. So I'm not against it. It doesn't work for me. But I'm probably moderate low carb. But I think when you look at the metabolic syndrome, certainly the biggest impact on those markers seems to be from a ketogenic diet.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I love the Mediterranean low carb approach. That's been my approach for the past couple of years. I mean, I will titrate up my carbohydrate intake depending on like my workouts, like how vigorously I'm exercising.
I'm the same. I noticed that as well. Yeah. I'm a morning person, and actually I find a bit of stuff. So I have porridge in the morning, right? I porridge
oatmeal,
oats.
right?
Yeah. No added sugar, but I put berries in there, pomegranate, some cacao powder, some flaxseed, some protein. And actually I find that works better for me. So in and around the workouts, I'll have a bit more starch. Not processed, but I tend to then, avoid any starch with dinner and that kind of stuff. So that's how but that makes sense. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I've been largely like grain free for the past couple of years, with the exception of like rice on my sushi. But I've been integrating even morning oats because I work out in the morning. So this is like pre-workout oats with some like casein protein mixed in.
Yeah.
And it's like I mean, not only is it delicious, but I feel like it does give me more energy.
Yeah.
In the gym.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I didn't do that for a while, when I used to work out, I used to always feel energized after work. I was like, I feel great and energy. I was still doing the same workouts when I was very low carb and I wasn't having any, starch at all, in the morning. And I used to find myself just feeling exhausted. And when I started putting it back in, I was like,
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, you're not even tied to any one like idea. You're not like paleo, explicitly ketogenic or anything like that.
No.
Yeah.
I do obsess about where there is the most consistent evidence we have in terms of the anti-inflammatory properties of the Mediterranean diet. So I'm like, olive oil every day. I'll have nuts and seeds, and I'll probably, sometimes max, to be honest. I mean, I come from an Indian origin background. Big foodie. I learned to cook for my dad when I was 16. I cook most days of the week. I cook Mediterranean food, a lot of Indian food. And we actually do use a lot of vegetables in Indian food and curries and everything else. And many days in the week, even though I'm someone that's probably I eat quite a lot of protein and meat, many days in the week, I'm getting through 7 to 10 portions of fruit and vegetables. In a day.
Yeah, I love it. And you're in great shape.
So yeah, not bad.
Yeah.
I've not quite got the six pack yet, but but my metabolic health is all optimized. Yeah.
Do you have a strong opinion on, because this is very contentious online these days, ultra processed seed oils, like refined, bleached and deodorized seed oils, vegetable oil, corn oil, soybean oil?
Not good. I mean, so the issue with these oils, certainly with the evidence and science, whatever that we have, is that when they're heated, especially when they're heated, they do produce these toxic compounds called aldehydes, which are very strongly correlated with dementia and heart disease and even cancer. So I try to avoid those seed oils completely, and I advise my patients to do the same.
They're quite prevalent. They've become quite prevalent over the years in India, whereas the ancestral fat would have been ghee.
Yes.
Now we're seeing this influx on the market in India.
Yeah.
And, along with, I mean, obviously, probably the food is becoming more processed over time as well. But like type 2 diabetes is now.
Oh, and heart disease, massive.
Heart disease,
Premature death from heart disease is highest prevalence in the world is India.
Wow.
So yeah, 100%, big problem.
Big problem. Well, I appreciate your time.
It's really good to talk to you, mate.
This was super fun. Is there anything else you want to add? I mean, we've got a fantastic, audience listening.
Yeah, listen. I mean, people. What would be great if people just go and look at the website nofarmfilm.com just to see what we're doing. There's a nice promotional video in there about what we're doing next. We're going to film in the summer in the States. A lot of it is going to be based on US data as well in terms of what's going wrong with medicine. And if people it's crowdfunding, so people can contribute, and they'll get the movie sent to them, when it comes out, and all sorts of other stuff. So it'd be great if people can just have a look and see what we're up to over there.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.